Foliage can be tricky to draw at the best of times, but when the foliage is made up of very, very, very small, very fine leaves that together make up a very relatively smooth but uneven surface, and yet still with gaps between fairly pointy, almost skewers of foliage that come up close together in small and fine clusters, it can be very challenging to find the marks that capture the effect of these leaves, their very small size, the way they're grouped together, and the fairly rigidly upright manner that they have visually. And therefore the overall visual effect that creates when they're all clustered together. And then you add to that how they react to the light coming from whatever direction it's coming from. Can be challenging, can almost feel overwhelming, and that can tempt us to take a shortcut and just do some sort of generalized pattern that can look very flat, or adopt other techniques that end up in our tree looking very cartoon-like. And it ends up being a lot less real than we would have liked. So let me talk you through and show you my process for drawing foliage, in this case a small tree or a large shrub, sort of in between there, that I came across on a recent trip to the coast. And I thought it made a great example, particularly the way the light was coming down from the upper left corner, and that lit up what we were seeing in certain ways. So the first thing, of course, always is to have a good look at what we're drawing and work out the form, the way that the volume is related to space around it. Where it comes out goes in, where the dents and bumps are, where it rolls around out of view, if it comes to a point or a sharp edge anywhere. Just really understanding the 3D modelling of the canopy that we're looking at. And in this, there were really three different canopies. There was the large one on the left, the upper right one, and then a smaller one below that. And they're all at different distances from us. So I want the closest one also to feel closer, because that's part of the effect. And one of the challenges in drawing trees, and particularly the foliage, is that they look three-dimensional, that we give them volume, that they're not just a cut-out silhouette shape. But we also need to have marks that do capture the effect of the foliage and the way the foliage is attached. So you'll notice I started by really doing a fairly loose dotted outline for the major areas that the canopies would take up each. And I'm partly doing that at the start so I can then refine it a bit as I go, but I've got somewhere to start with. But I'm also doing it that way with the dots because these marks won't compromise my ability to change what I'm doing later on. If they're in the end, if you like, in space, if they're too far from where I want the foliage to end, I'll just leave them there. They're not going to be particularly obvious. And if I don't go out far enough with the dot sort of edging guidelines, then I can simply go past them again without any problem, and they won't be obvious at the end. You can check my drawing at the end because I did adjust slightly the initial dotted outlines that you saw me do, and I don't think you'll see any problem with those when it's all finished. We shouldn't get hung up with marks that, if you like, are extra or not quite in the right place until we've absolutely finished, because we can't really judge the impact they're going to have until the end. So you'll see what I'm doing now. I'm using hatching with a lot of fine lines fairly close together. This is a 0.2 millimeter fine liner, Copic multi-liner pen. And that gives a nice fine line, which I think works well with the sense of this foliage, where it's like a lot of very tall, thin spikes, almost skewers of very fine leaves clustered close together. But I'm still not wanting to be thought to be I'm drawing each one, because they're far too fine for me to basically draw effectively. So I'm trying to still draw the overall effect. So I'm trying to capture, particularly with these marks that are consistent with this upright, very upright, rigid, tight foliage, trying to use marks that work with that, but also marks that reflect the overall curvature of this left-hand side canopy. That the part in the center is actually closer to us than the silhouette edge at the top or at the sides, and that it curves away from us underneath, and that attracts shade in different ways. And so I want my hatching to create the lights and darks, the values as well, that fine-tune the volume shape. Not just the big, I don't want this to look like a giant inflated balloon shape. I want there to be a lot of nuance of where small clusters go in and out across the surface of the whole cluster of leaves, of foliage. So you can see how it's starting to come together though. Now I don't go as far yet with this in terms of darkness, because now it's time to move into the other significant canopy on the tree. But this one's further back. This one, therefore, the colours aren't quite as intense, the greens don't have quite as much yellow in them, in fact, and I used to notice this when I painted trees a lot in oils. But also the edging is a little fainter, a little less distinct, the detail is a little less clear. And so that's partly why it looks further away, because that's the effect we have in life. And so with my marks, I want to keep them a bit lighter, and with the effect of less detail. What the detail I do draw needs to be accurate. It needs to represent what I want represented, but I want the overall effect to be less detailed than the one on the left-hand side that I've already drawn. And then there's that third cluster, which is further back again. It's now leaning away from us more. I want that to feel like it's even further away. And so I start to do the first marks for that. Now, notice with all these branches, I don't draw them in long continuous lines. I draw them in fairly short sections, because I find it's easier to get the right curvature, that the twists and the turns and the right angles or the acute angles, whatever the angles are, or where there's a lot clustered together in a small space. I find it easier to achieve that if I, in a way that looks more realistic, if I do the lines for the branches in relatively short bursts, and I have, if you like, slight gaps or unevenness where they change direction. The other thing I'd like you to notice is I establish right from the start which lines are closest and which lines are moving behind. And when lines for branches, especially if they're a single line for a twig, are moving behind others, I do my very best not to just draw them over the top of lines I've already drawn, because that kills any sense of depth. It puts the lines basically on a sheet of paper. And so I like to leave a very slight gap with a line that goes behind another line, for a twig that goes behind another twig. And I find that's very important to create a sense of this moving towards or away from us. And we also want the branches to also have a sense of moving towards us or away from us. That's in line with what the leaves they're holding up are doing. Now, we have another interesting plant feature in this scene, and that's this clumping plant that's underneath our small shrubby tree on the right-hand side. And this is the sort of plant that often causes problems. Part of the problem, I think, is that we understand what this looks like all too well, how it's formed, that these long strappy leaves all come out from a central core, and they come up and they flop over as they move around, as they come out further. And it's often tempting to try and just draw these almost as single lines that all burst out from one place in the same way. And it ends up just being a whole lot of lines that don't really look like a plant. We need to capture the shape of the leaves, and we need to capture the variation, the fact that the leaves that go sort of straight up in the center often just go fairly straight up, but as they grow longer and move outwards from the center, they tend to flop over more and creates this kind of loose pom-pom or half pom-pom effect. So I need to create marks that highlight some of these leaves. I need to be careful of the silhouettes to create the same silhouettes with some of the leaves that are in the reference. And I need to put the shadows in the lower half of the plant that reflect the shadows in our reference, that highlight, so we can see them more clearly, some of the leaves that we've drawn more carefully that the brain can latch onto to get a general idea of what all of these strappy leaves are doing and what sort of plant this is. And we need to take as much care as we do with our main subject tree. One thing that's starting to annoy me is I've become aware that I've drawn the lower part of the trunk of these branches just a little bit too wide. It's simply too thick. And I think that's because I drew them too quickly, too early on. It's just a bit too thick for the overall proportion of the tree and the canopy and the distance from the ground to the top of the canopy. So I need to remember to pay a little more attention to that next tree. If you've watched some of the tree drawing videos from my Drawing Trees playlist, you'll know I actually recommend starting by drawing the canopy and then working down towards the ground, because that way it's easier to control the width of the trunks and the larger branches so that everything stays in proportion. Because the sun's usually coming from one direction and one side of the branches or trunk is in shade, if we err on the side of making the trunk too thin, we can push it out slightly on that dark side. But the real challenge is to find the right marks to capture the leaves for the right size that they are, for the scale that they are. Something that works for the leaves both over the whole plant, whether they're in larger clumps or smaller groups at a greater or lesser distance. And all the time with our hatching, trying to create an effect that captures the various undulations of the big picture surface of these canopy areas. It can be tempting to do our hatching lines overly long, just trying to cover things quickly, but shorter lines take more time, but they let us create more effect, more undulations, more nuance in the surface and capturing more shadows and creating more light areas. I decided early on that I wasn't going to do the detail behind the tree, the buildings that we can see through on the far side of the beach and the mountain range behind, in the interest of greater clarity to see the tree. Now that I've established some of the values for that second canopy area and the third one as well, I can start to go back and forth between the three of them to establish more nuance, to make adjustments of one relative to the other so that the closest one feels sharper and stronger and closer. This is where it's helpful to slow down and to observe our drawing and the effects we've created as carefully as we're observing the reference, and not to go too dark too quickly on areas of, if you like, secondary prominence. Creating marks for this closer section of canopy that feel closer from a darker value created and sharper edges and effects. This is where it's really easy to overdraw, to just keep doing what we're doing because we don't pause and compare and think and evaluate, and we end up making all the areas look the same. Of course, you'll find this reference photo on my channel community page if you'd like to have a go. And if you've got to this point and you haven't hit the like button yet, why not do that for me? You might find my Drawing Trees playlist helpful. Huge range of different types of trees, different types of leaves at different distances and in different positions relative to each other and to other things in the subject, and all things to do with foliage and grass and flowers. But in the end, whatever you watch and however you draw and however it turns out, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.